Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. So let's get going. As has been mentioned, I have a book out called What's Wrong with Ayn Rand's Objectivist Ethics, which presumably most of you are aware of the topic. But I want to start with a more general question, which is, why are millions of readers drawn to Ayn Rand's works? And I think the basic answer is that Ayn Rand lays out this vision where the individual is the hero of his own life. The individual is a productive, rational person who has great independence of mind and of effort. It's a person who does not accept knowledge or values based on the authority of others. So I wanted to read a line from Atlas Shrugged from John Galt's speech. As far as I know, there's one person in here who has never read Ayn Rand. Maybe there's more than one. So hopefully this will be a little bit technical in some respects, but hopefully it'll be friendly to people even if you don't know much or anything about Ayn Rand. But here's a line from Atlas Shrugged from the hero's speech, John Galt's speech, which I think sort of encapsulates the vision that she offers. Do not lose your knowledge that man's proper estate is an upright posture, an intransigent mind, and a step that travels unlimited roads. The world you desire can be one. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It's yours. And in the About the Author section for Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand writes, my philosophy in essence is the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. And I think this is the general sort of vision that attracts so many people to her work. So I want to also start with some general points of where does Ayn Rand go right? Now, you notice that the title of my book is not, as some people seem to have assumed, Ayn Rand is wrong about everything. That's not the book, okay? And that's not what I think, despite some of the very heated discussions on social media. Largely, in some cases from people who have not read my book and who proclaim loudly that they refuse to. But I want to just point out here briefly that I still agree with Ayn Rand on a great many points, and I'll mention some of the broad ones tonight. There is an external world that we perceive through our senses and that we can come to know by our reason. It's reason, not faith, not authority, not some kind of mystical insight, that is our only path to knowledge. Turning to the field of ethics, a value is such to a particular actor, to a living creature, a person, or it's applicable to other living things too. But there's no such thing as some kind of transcendent value above and beyond the values of living things, no kind of cosmic value. So I agree with Rand on that general point. And when we move to politics, people thrive when they are free from force, when they are free from the coercion of others, and when they are in a political system in which individual rights are paramount. So again, I agree with Ayn Rand on all these broad points and on many other smaller and large points. So what is the point of contention then? I am arguing that Ayn Rand's specific meta-ethical arguments, as she develops partly in Atlas Shrugged and also in more detail in her 1961 essay, The Objectivist Ethics, is basically wrong. And here's how I would summarize the conclusions of her arguments from that work. For living things, including human beings, values normally orient to survival, the survival of the acting organism. Meaning for human beings who have choice, our values should orient to our survival. Our survival is individuals. Now, of course, that's not the whole story. John Galt's speech is not a paragraph. It's quite a bit longer than a paragraph, you may have noticed. So here's a few details, a few highlights. And again, I'm going to spend a few minutes tonight. I can only hit some highlights of Rand's ideas and some highlights of my criticisms, and that's what we're going to be able to get through, and then we can get to some additional details in the Q&A period. So Rand emphasizes that she's concerned with our survival as human beings. So what is the essential fact about human beings? We survive by use of our rational minds, our reason. And so she's concerned with survival over the course of your life, and for human beings, our survival as reasonable, rational beings. So she's very much a virtue ethicist. So her paramount virtue is rationality. And every other virtue is an aspect or derivative of that paramount virtue. So for example, productiveness is an application of rationality to your material needs. Honesty, independence. Ayn Rand, of course, says that as human beings, we have choice. So we have to choose to live. We have to choose to pursue our lives, generally, and we also have to choose the particular values by which we live. So some people are in the flower industry, some people are in the computer industry, right? This will vary from person to person, but still we're choosing the particular values by which we live. And she also, in one of the quotes, Rand mentions happiness as being our moral purpose. So how does that fit into the survival aspect of her theory? Well, for Rand, these are not two separate goals. When you rationally pursue your survival, the consequence, the result is happiness at an emotional level. So these are not two different paths. They're part and parcel of the same general pathway. Of course, there's much more that can be said about this. There's many articles and books that have been written, but I think that'll suffice to highlight some of the essentials for our purposes. So just to give this a bit more fleshing out, John Galt, again in Atlas Shrugged, describes the fundamental alternative that any living thing faces and that we as human beings face as existence or non-existence. And that pertains only to living organisms, right? So it's being in existence as a living thing, which is central to her approach to ethics. And here's how Rand offers more detail on this in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. You'll notice that my title refers specifically to this essay, The Objectivist Ethics, which is what I'm primarily concerned with. She writes, "It is only a living organism that faces a constant alternative, the issue of life or death. Life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. It is only the concept of life that makes the concept of value possible." So again, I want to emphasize that this distinction between life and death is central to Rand's approach to ethics. And the main thrust of her approach is that we need to take actions to keep ourselves on the life side of the ledger as opposed to death. Now, she also talks about the concepts involved, right? So she's making a claim, just a metaphysical relationship between values and life, and that values normally orient to the survival of an organism. Okay? But this also pertains, for human beings, if we properly understand the concepts of life and values, we understand this relationship if we have a proper conception of them. That's why she talks about the relationship of the concepts. So here's what Rand says a bit later. An ultimate value is that final goal or end to which all lesser goals are the means. Okay? So she's talking about there's a final goal and all of our lesser goals that are means to that end. An organism's life is its standard of value. That which furthers its life is the good. That which threatens it is the evil. So this should give you at least an indication that I'm on the right track when I describe Rand's theory. So I describe Rand's theory as survivalist in orientation, because the thrust is individuals should take action, rational action, to pursue their survival over the course of their lifespan. Now there are people who disagree with my take on what Rand's ethics is about. And certainly there are people who describe it as survivalists who aren't getting a lot of the details, but I think that I'm getting the details, the relevant details, and that is an accurate way to describe Rand's moral theory. So we can debate that more later, but that's sort of the ground that I'm standing on. Now I do think that we can open the question, does Rand's formal moral theory that she presents in the Objectivist Ethics, does that actually square with all of her other moral commitments? And here I just want to point out, I mean, of course, Rand's defenders say yes. It's like, yes, the Objectivist Ethics in 1961 sort of caps and wraps the conclusion around and explains all of her other moral commitments that she's made prior to that. Now, my position is no. What I think is actually going on is Rand is making a misstep here, and that her formal theory is not actually compatible with a lot of the moral commitments that she herself holds. So I want to point out, though, that so Rand was born in 1905 in Russia, right? I don't know if you know this story. But by her first major success as a novelist was The Fountainhead, which came out in 1943. And even by the point of The Fountainhead, she was already thinking in terms of survival as having a key role in her moral theory. So in 1943, she writes, "The reasoning mind allows man to survive." And that's actually a line from Howard Work, the hero of that novel. But by 1945, Rand had still not worked out a formal theory to explain that aspect of her ethics. And by the way, I learned about these journal entries. There's a big fat book of her journal entries that's been published. And I learned about these particular entries from an essay by a fellow philosopher named Darrell Wright, who writes a great essay about sort of this transition. And at that point in 1945, Rand says that a person needs a rational decision or an axiom, which is what? She writes, "I wish to survive, my survival is desirable." Well, that's not sounding quite like what we saw before. Why should we accept this, she wonders, or she asks for our sake. She writes, "You don't have to. It is an axiom to be accepted as self-evident." Well, saying that a human being ought to pursue their survival as their ultimate moral end is it's just not a self-evident truth, right? And it's not a philosophic axiom either. And it's not what she's arguing by the time of her 1961 essay. So between the writing of The Fountainhead and the writing of Atlas Shrugged, she is spending a lot of effort to develop her formal moral theory. But by that time, she already has a great many moral ideas developed and arguments pertaining to those ideas, okay? And so what I'm saying, so again, part of my point is that I think Ayn Rand gets a lot right, even early on, but then she takes a misstep by the time of the Objectivist Ethics and even Atlas Shrugged in this particular way. And I wanted to just give you one example of a way in which I think that John Galt's formal theory doesn't quite mesh with his actions, his own moral commitments. So I apologize if you haven't read the novel. This will be a spoiler. You can plug your ears for the next 2 minutes if you're so inclined, but it's not that major of a spoiler. So those of you who have read the novel, which I think is almost everyone in this room, you'll remember that at a certain point, the bad guys take John Galt prisoner. And he has this concern that the bad guys will torture the love of his life to make him, if they discover that they have this romantic relationship. And so he says to his partner, he says, "Look, if they actually are going to torture you, I will just kill myself and end that right there." Now, that didn't happen in the book, right? But what if things had turned out differently? Would John Galt really have killed himself to save Dagny this horror of being tortured by the villains? I think the answer, yeah, he clearly would have. He would have killed himself. But this puts him in this gives him a problem in terms of the formal ethics that he lays out in his speech, right? Because if your survival is your ultimate goal and all your other values are means toward that end, well, where does suicide in this case, or frankly any case, fit into this moral theory? Now, people have made a case as to why this actually is in your rational, egoistic, survival-oriented interest to commit suicide. But I'm going to push on that and say that's a really difficult case to make. And it's on its face, doesn't make sense. And I think the more you push it, it still doesn't make sense, right? But we can, again, people do, and we can debate that later if you want to. So what do I think is wrong with Ayn Rand's approach to ethics? Now, I want to point out, right, I think that she deserves a great deal of credit for pointing out the moral significance of survival, which is something that, to my knowledge, no other philosopher prior to her spends much, if any, attention on, right? But it's actually profoundly important. I mean, after all, if you're not alive, you can't pursue any value whatsoever. So that automatically makes it profoundly important, right? And obviously, a great many of our values do directly feed our survival. We're all eating food, drinking water, right? We all have shelter over our heads. We keep ourselves warm. We exercise. We go to the doctor, right? Countless things we do through the course of our day is directly related to keeping ourselves healthy and alive. And so I think Rand is right to draw to point out the moral significance of that. Nevertheless, I don't think that it's the fundamental as Rand has it. And so here I can only, again, hit some highlights, right? I can't present my complete case. I can present some short versions of some of my arguments. But here's my main argument. We experience some things as valuable for their own sake, as ends in themselves, and not as further means to survival. That's my main argument, okay? That's my main objection to Rand's theory. And, if this is true, if it's true that we experience some things as valuable for their own sake and not as means to survival, then that just means that Rand's theory is wrong. So let me point out, I'll give you a few examples, right? But the first one, because it's very visceral and easy to discuss, having sex with a loving partner. I'm going to argue that we experience that as an end in itself. Now, it's also true that sex normally has health benefits, right? So it does serve your survival. Okay, so great. It does both things, right? You're a sexual altruist. But so here's a very quick thought experiment just to get you thinking about what's really the fundamental motivation here, right? Let's say you learned that you had a condition. Every time you had sex, you were going to shorten your life by 1 minute. Okay. I mean, most people would not stop having sex. Right? They would still have a lot of. They might cut it down somewhat. It'd be like, Thursdays, I'm going to take a Thursday, something. But right, But I think that indicates, right, this is not the kind of thing. We're not doing this solely or fundamentally for our survival benefit. We're doing it because we experience it as an end in itself, and we actually pursue our survival largely as a means to these values that we experience as ends in themselves. Here's a quick list of some other examples: having and raising a child, listening to a piece of fine music, watching a beautiful sunset, reading a finely written work of philosophy. I think that all of these can be experienced as ends in themselves and not as further means to survival. Now I want to emphasize this point as my second point in this sequence, this point about children, right? I think it's extremely implausible that people normally have children to further their own survival. I'm a parent now, right? And it seems just wildly implausible to me. But this is really the point of it, and this is what it actually accomplishes. So this is especially obvious if you look before the advance of modern medicine. For women, getting pregnant, having a child was extremely dangerous. You had a very good chance of dying from this experience. Okay, so what would an objectivist say to somebody back then? Well, you should try everything you can to not get pregnant because it's obviously contrary to your survival. That's kind of a difficult case to make, I think. It doesn't quite ring the right way. But even today, it can be quite dangerous. My wife got severe preeclampsia just prior to childbirth. She had to do an emergency C-section. Now, today we have good medical treatment, so maternal death rates, young child death rates are radically lower than they once were, which is great. But these kind of diseases still kill women every year, even in the United States. So why is it that people do and should have children? To further their own survival, I'm arguing no, because children bring enormous benefit to our lives and enormous value to our lives, but because we're experiencing this as valuable for its own sake in some sense. Okay, another general line of argument, the biology. I'm going to say that Rand's biology is simply mistaken. So here's a quick line from the Objectivist Ethics. The functions of all living things are directed to a single goal, the maintenance of the organism's life. And if you're interested, there's an entire book that's basically on that theme. It's by Harry Binswanger, written long ago, and it's called The Biological Basis of Teleological Concepts. And it's largely just about that point. But I'll just give you a few examples that I think readily disproves her basic biological claims. So there's something called a macrophagous spider. Macrophagous means mother eating. Why is it called that? Because after the spider lays its eggs, then its body turns mushy and all the little spiderlings eat her up alive. Okay? So is reproduction a function aimed toward the survival of the mother spider? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say no. Right? But this is not, it's a dramatic example, right? But it's hardly the exception to the rule. It's an illustration of the rule. Generally speaking, individual members of species put a great deal of resources into reproduction of their genes, not just their personal survival. They do both, right? But it's the reproduction of their genes. So just another couple quick examples. The male praying mantis. When the male praying mantis has sex, he stands a good chance of getting his head bitten off by the female. When the female is done with him, she will then eat him up. which is great for her, obviously toward her survival and the survival of the offspring. Not so good for the male praying mantis. Bees will sacrifice themselves for the hive. Parent birds will often try to divert a predator away from their nest, which is dangerous to the parent birds. These are not rare exceptions, right? This is the rule that individual organisms spend efforts on the reproduction of their genes, not just their personal survival. So in biology, values orient to the survival of the genes, not survival. Now, I want to emphasize here, right, because a lot of people are confused on this point. I am not saying, certainly not, that the point of ethics for human beings is to further our genes. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that's the wrong way to look at it, right? But neither is it to pursue our survival. And so why is this relevant? When Rand talks about the relationship of values to life, in that the values normally orient to life, I think that the points about biology illustrate that she's just wrong about that basic relationship. I'm going to do a couple of other more derivative points here. How many of you are familiar with the term free rider problem? If you've done any economics or parts of practical ethics. Oh, not as many as I would have guessed. Well, let me just use the example of charity, which involves a free rider problem, but I'll try not to use the technical language, right? Why would an egoist, concerned with their own survival as their primary goal, be interested in giving to charity to strangers, or doing things like sacrificing or risking their lives for strangers? Why would someone give money to a charity in Africa to keep Africans alive, when I could spend that money on myself to develop my own life and survival and happiness? Well, I'm going to suggest that there's not really ultimately a very good reason. Now, there's a lot of types of charity that you could plausibly argue is good for the egoist to give to, but I'm going to argue that there's a lot of types of charity that's just, it's hard to make the case that the egoist, as Rand lays it out, is really going to spend much, if any, attention to that. And here's another type of, this is a difficult case, and this one will be very controversial. Now, and this pertains to respecting others' rights, right? It's very obvious why I, as an egoist, would want all of you to respect my rights and not try to force me, not try to take my stuff, etc. It's a little bit less obvious why the egoist would want to respect everyone else's rights. Now, I do think that Rand's case is a lot subtler than she often gets credit for. And so I'm arguing that she makes some very strong arguments that when you live in a society of generally rights-respecting behavior, it really is in your interest to respect others' rights. Unfortunately, we don't always find ourselves in that context. So here's just an example I mentioned in the book. What about slavery before the Civil War in the American South? Let's say you were born into a slaveholding family. Your family has held slaves for however long, right? And you grew up to inherit the plantation along with all the slaves, along with all the debts of the plantation. And not only that, but where you live, it's actually illegal for you to free your slaves. Those laws actually existed in parts of the American South. So let's say you could speak back in time as an objectivist to this person. What would be your case to this person? Look, you should act egoistically, pursue your own survival and resulting happiness, and therefore you should free your slaves in the conditions that you're in. I'm going to suggest that that's a difficult case to make. Now, again, I'm sure that objectivists will try. There are some plausible arguments they can pursue, or at least they can start out plausibly. But I don't think ultimately they're going to be able to make a strong case to that person that they should free their slaves. Even though I think Rand herself would probably say, yeah, you should totally free your slaves. And I think most people who are objectivists would say, yeah, you should free your slaves. Even though they would try to argue, well, there's going to be these subtle benefits, even though you're going to lose your livelihood, you're going to run into trouble with the authorities and so on. But I would say, I mean, at this point, you could get into a lot of detail, but I'll just say, let me put the onus of proof onto the objectivists, and let's see how they can make that case. I think that it's impossible, frankly. So again, these are just some highlights of the sorts of arguments I make throughout the course of the book. There's others, like I talk about the infamous indestructible robot, which Rand talks about in her essay. I guess by the reaction, it's not infamous at all. Anyway, she talks about a robot, I promise. But that'll just give you a flavor for the sorts of criticisms I'm making. So to conclude, I think that Ayn Rand gets a whole lot right. more than almost any of her critics recognize. In fact, in my first chapter, I go through some typical examples of some of the criticisms that people make against her. And usually in the popular press, what people say about Rand is just ridiculous. It's just wildly inaccurate presentation of her ideas. So I try to be sensitive to this fact that Rand is very often misrepresented. So I'm arguing, I'm trying to give Rand her due here and say she gets a whole lot right. She gets a lot right about ethics. She gets a lot right about many other topics that are very important. But I do come to the conclusion that her meta-ethics is basically wrong. And with that, I'm fine to open it for questions.
Working for his own survival, has slaves, why would he free them? And I get from your argument that you're saying he wouldn't, if he follows the pure survivalist instinct, then he would not have any reason to free the slaves because that would be self-sacrificial.
That's my claim, yes.
Okay,
Did everybody hear the question? I don't know how.
Cool.
I'm mic'd up, everybody else is not. So.
Yeah,
That's what I think is the case.
All right, great. That's what I thought you meant. I just wanted to clarify.
And just incidentally, I mean, I hope that even people who think that I'm just dreadfully wrong about Rand still find the book interesting because I tried really hard to dig into Rand's arguments, and especially that's my longest chapter, the one on rights. And I try really hard to do my best to present the strongest case that I can from Rand's perspective. And I think I get into a lot of details on that and other issues that even defenders of objectivism often gloss over or don't get into deeply. So,
I read your book twice, Ari, as you know.
You're half my reader, no.
Before I get to my question, let me just say that I am a long-time student of Rand. I like to think I've lived my life consistent with what I've learned from her. And let me say, though I disagree with Ari's thesis, I think everybody that is interested in Rand should buy this book and read it. Because it's, as I've said to you before, it's scholarly, it's respectful, and it's a work that it adds to the body of what surrounds her work. So I would urge, get your own copy. My question.
Thank you. I agree. You should get your own copy.
What motivated you to write it?
So the question is, what motivated me to write it? Well, I've been thinking about this for a long, long time, and I've gone back and forth to a certain degree. But the main thing is, I wanted to figure out what the truth is. So after being persuaded by something for a long time, and then you start to have doubts about it, I mean, to me, I either needed to figure out why I was having doubts and why my doubts were unfounded, or what's actually wrong with it, and then what do I think the truth is? So, that's basically it to get to the truth. And so, but I will mention, some objectivists seem to think that it should be really important that I'm able to persuade them. And so I hear comments like, well, I'm not going to find this persuasive, so I'm not even going to read, it's like, my motivation is not really to persuade objectivists. For one thing, I don't think I'm going to persuade hardly any objectivists that I'm right about this. I think that there are some people that I will persuade, but I'm mainly arguing, I'm trying to raise the arguments with objectivists, but I think there are a lot of people who have heard of Rand or are interested in Rand. I think they'll be more open to persuasion if they're not strongly committed already. So I do hope, but I also think that I think it's true. I think a lot of people get hung up on Rand's ideas generally because they get hung up on some of these big problems. They get hung up on the selfishness, obviously. And in a certain respect, I agree with Rand on the selfishness in a certain respect. But my hope is that by laying out some of these ideas and this criticism of Rand's theory and pointing to a slightly different direction, which in my last chapter I think Rand actually heads in a little different direction before she changes course, in a direction that I basically agree with. You can read that if you want and see if you agree with my take. But I think that it's actually will make Rand's where Rand goes right. I think those ideas will be more appealing to people generally if we can talk about where did she go wrong, and maybe we need some fixes here, in these certain areas. But then we can be more, people may be more open to seeing where does she go right. Because just because Rand makes some mistakes doesn't mean she's wrong about everything. And just because people are very often, they basically misunderstand what Rand is about. Obviously, that doesn't prove anything. So part of the goal is just, hey, what does Rand actually think? And then where does she go right, where does she go wrong? So I guess the motive is, primarily I want to know what the truth is as well as I can get there. And then hopefully I'll further help the discussion surrounding Ayn Rand's ideas, help further that along.
Who else has a question? Tim?
Not really related to directly what you're saying, but I'm curious. Look at microphone. Now I don't have to yell. I'm curious if you've heard of the theory of a type of economy known as a gift economy, which is what primitive societies have before they start trading with each other. I think it explains a lot of the sort of traditional ethical systems that we have that Rand was trying to critique and address.
Yeah, I don't have a comment about that specifically, but you might have gotten the idea. I'm a lot more interested in evolutionary biology than Rand was. Rand was basically not interested. She basically said, I don't know anything about this, and that was kind of her position. But I think that there's a lot built into human dispositions from biology.
Mark, thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, in Rand's body of work, was there ever a position or an idea that she established, but then at a later date revised or changed, or did something along what you're doing to say either I found additional information that makes me think differently, and would that add credence to what you're doing?
I don't think that would add. So the question is, did Rand ever change her mind?
Yeah.
And I think that's important to answer because people try to make Rand out to be this dogmatist who was always right and never changed her mind. But the fact is, she did change her mind over the years, and she talked about that in certain ways. And I would think the biggest way she changed her mind is she started out as an individualist. Remember, she grew up in Russia, right? So she was very much. Early on, she was very much attracted to the rhetoric of Nietzsche. And you can debate how much the actual ideas influenced her, but certainly she sounded a lot more Nietzschean in her early years than she did in her later years. And she came to explicitly reject Nietzsche's ideas for specific reasons. So that would be to me, that's the most obvious way that she changed over time. She basically moved consistently toward an objective ethics and not something based on whim, emotion, the power of the strong man, nothing like that. She moved very much away from that. It took her time to develop it.
Crancy.
Which one?
The handsome one.
That's pretty bad.
Oh, your brothers. That's right. I forgot.
The one mom liked. Okay, then I'll go first. What if Rand were born in Westchester County and had a nice middle-class upbringing? How much, of her life is the reflex against, Bolshevism and ruining her life and the things she saw? What would she have been without that formative experience?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to say where Rand would have been if she hadn't been born and raised and witnessed the Russian Revolution. Obviously, it had a big impact on her life. Right? She really reacted extremely strongly to communism. She always hated the communists.
How could you?
But, you say that, right? But let's not forget, there were a lot of Americans who went over to visit the Soviet Union and who thought it was a wonderful thing, a wonderful experiment, right? So there were people who had that upbringing, like similar to what you mentioned, who actually thought communism was wonderful. And Rand later met her sister. Her sister was able to come over. And I can't remember if she went back or I can't remember the details. But her sister very much had different ideas and was nowhere nearly as critical of the Soviet regime as Rand was. And so, yeah, in a way, it was profoundly influential to her. But in another way, it's not like what formed her views. She formed her views in that context, but she formed her views based on her own thinking and who she was and so on.
So Ari, I didn't read all of Atlas Shrugged. And one part, I know. I know.
Dude,
I'll
you do run
burn him. I listened to the abridged version that is on audiobooks or something like that. And so one part that's missing from that actually is the kidnapping. That's not in the abridged version that's on audiobooks. So I hadn't heard about that, but I'm curious. I know that Ayn Rand took her characters very seriously, and especially Jean Galt, like that was her epoch of man inclusive of women too. But do you think that she was being literal with the decision that he had to make between sacrificing himself, or do you think that was more of a dramatic twist because it's a novel after all? Do you really think that she was trying to say that what man should be is somebody that does want to sacrifice for their loved one?
Well, Rand is perfectly serious that in that context, if that were real life, John Galt would have committed suicide in that context. Rand would certainly not have said that was counted as a sacrifice, right? She would have said it's perfectly self-interested to commit suicide in those contexts because it was for his values. And there's more about suicide. So Leonard Peikoff has the example of suicide. Leonard Peikoff has the book Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, which remains, this came out in '91, I think, but it remains the best, most comprehensive presentation of Rand ideas. And Peikoff he was Rand's close associate. This is just a brief note of background, right? So he spent countless hours discussing Rand's ideas with Rand, so I regard that book as an accurate presentation of her ideas. Anyway, he has an example of suicide and says it would be perfectly fine to commit suicide in certain contexts. So another big example, if you have a debilitating, horrible, terminal illness, can be okay, morally okay, and even to commit suicide. And there's other examples. Another character in Atlas Shrugged actually kills herself. Cheryl Taggart. It's extremely tragic. And we're led to, as readers, we think, well, Cheryl, it's extremely tragic, and if she had been able to think about things from better or broader perspective, she would not and should not have done that. But from her own perspective, it's very understandable within the context of the novel. So, yeah, she's dead serious. In certain contexts, suicide can be, rational and in your own interests.
Thank you. Dave?
I don't have a question, I have an opinion.
Are we on to opinions now? Are we
I
on to
have
questions?
one more question.
Okay.
Well, let's do the one more question first.
When will
Sorry.
the audiobook come out? Read by the author.
Yeah, it won't.
That's
Well,
just-
it will come out when someone wishes to
To pay
do a
for it.
fundraiser, yeah. Because,
Those things cost money.
let's just say it's a niche. It's a niche project.
Who would read your audiobook if you were to choose somebody? Who would narrate it?
How about Dave Walden?
High honor.
Sweet
You'd have to-
I would do it.
Tim, did you have?
One last question. Yeah, I remember the question I really wanted to ask the first time. Sorry. So while I completely agree that survival cannot be, agree that survival cannot be the ultimate standard in ethics, one possible solution to this problem is to propose something else as the ultimate standard. Do you propose one in your book or not?
I do tentatively.
Okay.
And I'll summarize it briefly. And so it won't probably be persuasive unless you read it. But I think I have
We
some.
have to have a reason to read the book. Can't give away everything.
On the last page is the answer to life. And I'm not going to tell you. No. So before I mentioned what I think is the big idea here, which is that we actually experience certain things as valuable for their own sake. And I think even Rand has a lot of ideas about the choice to live, and I have a section about the choice to live and that the role that plays in Rand's theory. And so, but even for Rand, even the background for this choice to live, well, why would you do this? There has to be, I would say, there has to be some reason to do this. And even some objectivists will talk about, in effect, there should be some reason for it to choose to live. But if there's some reason to choose to live, well, let's look at what this reason is. Maybe that's the fundamental, and that's what I think is the case. So I think that we do experience certain things as valuable for their own sake, and this becomes very complicated because a lot of what we experience through our judgments and our resulting emotions. So it becomes extremely complicated because there's a lot of biology built in, and there's a lot of our judgments built in. So some people are terrified of any number of things, right? Even being in a room or being at heights or something, whereas other people, it's no problem at all, and it's based largely on their developed judgments of the world. So it becomes extremely complicated. But here's the upshot. I think we value certain things as ends in themselves, and the goal of ethics is to simply rationally integrate our values into this consistent life. So I, similarly to Ayn Rand, say the moral purpose of my action is my life. I just mean something a little different than what Rand means by that. Or rather, I mean what Rand means to the degree that she's going along the path that I'm also going along, which I think she does to a large degree.
You're adding to that. You're making it a little bit more explicit.
Yeah, I'm trying to explicitly say, look, I think Rand made a wrong turn, but I think a lot of what Rand is talking about turns out to be true. And I think if you follow that, Rand is very much concerned to root out subjectivism. And she would be very concerned that where I'm headed is subjectivist, but I don't think that that's true at all. And I think that that's a big reason why she reached her meta-ethics. I think she was very much interested in something concrete, you can point to, it's like scientific, right? Something is alive or it's dead, right? We can study this, right? So she wanted to put her ethics on a scientific grounding. And I agree, it can be scientific in a certain respect. I just think that she got the basics wrong as to how that works out.
A basic biological knowledge would have helped quite a bit. I see that lacking in objectivists in general, as they really eschew biology as a prime factor in how one lives.
Well, Rand just said, as I quote in the book, she just says straight out, she doesn't know anything about evolutionary biology, and she doesn't know if it's true. That's what she says. But realize she was born in 1905.
Right.
Right? What year did they discover the role of DNA in evolution? That was long after that, right? And when did, as I point this out, right? When was this popularized, right? When did most people actually come to know this? It was long after Rand was working on her material. But I will point out, there is a whole book devoted to the biology by Harry Winsmeyer, which hardly anyone reads. But it's actually really interesting. I recommend it if you're interested in Rand.
I was going to recommend to you to delve deeper into the biological aspect of things. Robert Sapolsky wrote a voluminous tome called Behave, the biology of human beings at our best and worst. And he's a neurobiologist and endocrinologist and primatologist. He is amazing. Read the book if you can, and it will be very insightful.
You might be interested in this side note, maybe. Is everybody still okay for a few minutes, or you done? Okay. So Rand talks about, she agrees with some of the empiricists that we're blank slates. We're a blank slate when we're born. And a lot of people think that she has a big problem by saying we're a blank slate. But there's two ways you can look at that, right? Do we have any inborn ideas as Plato thought we did? Do we come into the world actually knowing about the world, at least in some implicit or hidden sense? Or do we come out into the world and then learn everything that we come to know through perceiving the world around us and then reasoning logically about that? And I agree with Ayn Rand that in that sense we are blank slates. But in another sense, there's a whole lot into our behavior from the moment we're born that has a lot to do with our biology, which has a lot to do with our evolutionary history.
And environment and culture.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
But there's a lot, which that can alter, right? But the biology, that's a very, very long biological pathway that we're on. And I think that Rand and objectivists tend to want to say that we're blank slates in the sense that we've kind of evolved beyond biology in a certain respect. And I think that that is the wrong way to look at things.
Well, I think we'll conclude it there.
Oh, wait, we have another,
Just kidding, Dan.
another question over there.
No, are we on to
We have
Dave?
another question over there.
Just a quick question.
Okay.
So, do you because you said something pretty specific, do you conceive in your ethics of the choice to live as being an ethical question? Because I just wanted to clarify for some folks who are listening to Ari, Rand herself is extremely clear on that point. I think you said that, I know that you know this, but just to clarify, Rand herself says the choice to live is prior to ethics. It itself is not a choice that is subject to ethical evaluation. And so I'm wondering if your conception of that is, you see that as a moral question.
And is the choice to live pre-moral and beyond moral evaluation?
Prior to
Now,
moral evaluation.
yeah, now I do think that that is Rand's position.
It is.
Leonard Peikoff thinks that that's Rand's position. But there's actually people who think that that's not Rand's position. And this has been a running debate for a very, very long time. Incidentally, if you're interested in the debate, the last chunk of my book is just an appendix, which goes through a lot of sources very briefly. If you're interested, it will give you some good, interesting places to start. And I talk about some of the people who actually think that's not true. But here's my take on the choice to live. It's important to Rand because survival, as life as opposed to death, is of paramount importance. So how do you get to this point where we're in the survival camp, right? Like, you should survive. Why? She has to have an answer to that, right? And ultimately her answer is, you don't have to, right? It's a choice, and you can choose to live or not. But my take is that, because I don't think that her basic approach is right, I don't think that the choice to live has the central position in the moral theory that she thinks it does. Most people simply don't actually think about this, right? The only time you actually consciously think about whether you should live is if you're suicidal, or if you're in this very unusual for us as Americans position of having to think about, well, would I be better off just ending it now, right? You don't normally think about that until you're already pretty old. Now, at a certain point, yeah, especially if you read existentialism, you're going to think, well, is my life worth living? Should I kill myself? Or should I keep living? So it does become a conscious choice. But I think people are already making many moral commitments by the time that they think about it consciously. Now, I think objectivists would say, well, you're implicitly choosing to live by pursuing your life in that way. And that's fine. Okay, fine. But to me, I guess I just don't see it as it's like, yeah, it doesn't play the pivotal role to me. The reason it has to play a pivotal role to her is because she needs to get to survival as her ultimate aim. I don't think that we need to do that. So the choice to live doesn't play that key theoretical role. But I have I do have a big section on this. But I will note one distinction, okay? So this is interesting, right? So almost all of you have read Atlas Shrugged, right? I'm sorry, this is going to be another spoiler. So who is the big example in Atlas Shrugged of somebody who chooses not to live? It's James Taggart, right? And in the end, there's this great psychological breakdown when you realize that, his psychology is laid bare to himself and he can no longer handle being himself because he's such a horrible person. So he's revealed to have chosen not to live throughout the course of the novel. But I'll point out that objectivists also talk about, and Rand talks about this later on in a different essay, about you can just sort of not do anything. So it's not being proactively against life like James Taggart. It's just let's say somebody just they just woke up one day, but they had no motivation to get out of bed or eat or do anything, right? Imagine somebody just drifting toward death. Rand talks about that too. But I'm suggesting that those are very different things. Just drifting toward death is not choosing to live. But then there's this proactive sense of not choosing to live in the James Taggart sense, where you're evading, you're psychologically corrupt. And those are two really different things. And I think that Rand doesn't Rand doesn't make a good effort to distinguish those things. I think that causes some problems for her, just to,
Just because something is different psychologically doesn't mean it's different morally or philosophically.
Well, no, there is a difference because James Taggart is morally evil for choosing not to live. Somebody who just drifted, who made no choice, who just did nothing, who just drifted toward death, that would be the position where we could not morally evaluate the person. But practically speaking, this doesn't. Right, point to an example where that happens. Right? Some people are so depressed they stop taking action. So I guess that would be the closest you can get. But even then, we think, well, if they could get some good counseling, hopefully they could or the right drugs or whatever, they could kind of jumpstart out of that and get back onto the path of living. So it's hard to see where that sort of choice not to live or not choosing to live actually happens in real life.
We'll probably conclude with Dave here.
I discovered Rand in 65. Understanding her ideas took literally years. Living consistently with them, to the extent that I do now, is probably one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do. And it's made only more difficult by the thinking of some claimed objectivists, and more importantly, their behavior. The primary moral purpose that Rand writes about, while it starts to live or not live, it very quickly ends up to live in a certain way. And that without that certain way, then to drop context and say, live or not live is the choice, it's way more than that. And she makes that clear in her philosophy. Rand was not perfect. While you cited her drifting away from Nietzsche, which she embraced early on. Let me just ask everyone here a question. Do you think that Ayn Rand loved her husband, Frank O'Connor, in the manner that she writes about romantic love in her fictional novels?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Oh, you do?
I think so. I think yes.
I don't.
Ooh.
I don't think that's humanly possible.
Okay, I met Rand, and I didn't meet Frank, but I saw him. And I've read enough of the books written by Barbara Grandin, and I can't recall her name, but another female author has written a book, extensive book. And I would take issue with that.
I was at Ford Hall Forum when somebody asked Ayn Rand, they were talking about a lifeboat situation, about having to kill somebody else to save your life. And she said, I could not do that. But to save my husband's life, I could kill 10 people easily.
It was certainly, do you want me to comment or do you want to have something else? It was certainly an unusual relationship. And I think that she made a huge mistake in having an affair with Nathaniel Brandon. And that was extremely disastrous to her life. Everybody, I don't know if you know these details, but, so there's certainly sort of a brand of objectivist who treats Rand almost as a religious figure and who can hardly bear to admit that she might have made some mistakes in her personal life. I think that's a big mistake. There are also some people who call themselves objectivists who are not very good, who are really bad people. Like they're just very mean-spirited and kind of vicious. But there's a lot of objectivists. The objectivists I know are wonderful people. A lot of objectivists I know have great, thriving, successful businesses. They're in education. They're starting schools. They're building airplanes. They're doing all kinds of things that are just wonderful and beneficial to my life directly, and just inspirational to watch and look at. So, yeah, to me, those are the objectivists. And Rand at her best is objectivism. Rand, when she was having her affair and taking taking amphetamines probably too frequently, that to me is kind of an aberration. But yeah, I think I have a lot of respect for Ayn Rand and for objectivism and for the real objectivists that I know.
On survival, she said survival not at any price.
Right.
The survival of a rational being.
Right. That is exactly right. We've been an hour. Are you guys all getting tired on a Monday night?
Yeah, we'll close it down there.
Well, let me have.
Sorry, one more thing.
Yeah, I'll just respond to that briefly, right? You're right. Rand does talk about, well, it's not survival at any price. I'll just say I have a discussion on that exact quote in the book, and it's right because she builds a lot into that, and on top of that, so it's not just day-to-day survival or anything like that. Like it's not just this no principled approach to, well, where's my next hour going to come from? That's certainly not it. And I'm cognizant of that in the book, and I think I have a good discussion on that.
Thank you, Ari.